Hello, very warm welcome to you as you join us for this conversation with Tom Holland about his recent book, Dominion, published in North America by Basic Books and in the UK by Little Brown. And welcome to you, Tom. Many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tom Holland is a British historian and broadcaster and the prize-winning author of many books, including Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the House of Caesar, In the Shadow of the Sword, which deals with the period that saw the emergence of Islam, and Millennium, an account of the 2 centuries on either side of the year 1000. But in this latest volume, Dominion, Tom takes on 2,500 years of history, beginning with Athens in the 5th century BC and coming right down to the present day. And you can see the ambition even in the subtitle. In the UK edition, it's The Making of the Western Mind. But in North America, it's How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And that seems to be a telling difference, which maybe we can explore with Tom a little bit later. It's an extraordinary book whose 600 pages are packed with riveting stories of people, movements, and events across this huge span of time, from Julian the Apostate to the Beatles, Augustine of Hippo to Angela Merkel, Charlemagne to Voltaire, Elizabeth of Hungary to Nelson Mandela, Gregory of Nyssa to Friedrich Nietzsche. But it's all skillfully held together by one bold and controversial thesis. In its institutions, laws, morality, philosophy, values, politics, education, science, attitudes to sexuality, Western culture has been so profoundly shaped by the radical and subversive story of Jesus Christ that its impact is now often hidden from view, disguised as self-evident natural principles, universal human rights, or the truths of reason, when they're actually nothing of the sort. Tom argues that the most antagonistic and contemptuous criticisms of Christianity are often themselves based on ideas and insights uniquely derived from the faith itself, and especially from the life and teachings of its founder. Even in Europe, he writes, a continent with churches far emptier than the United States, the trace elements of Christianity continue to infuse people's morals and presumptions so utterly that many failed even to detect their presence. Like dust particles, so fine as to be invisible to the naked eye, they were breathed in equally by everyone, believers, atheists, and those who never paused so much to think about religion. Had it been otherwise, he says, then no one would ever have got woke. Tom, this is a massive book in more ways than one. What made you tackle such a vast and potentially contentious project?
Well, it's the reasons actually go very far back, probably all the way to my childhood, if I'm honest, because I was raised Christian in the Church of England by my mother, who is a very devout Anglican. So I went to church, I sang in the choir, I went to Sunday school, and I accepted it as young children do. But at the same time, I was secretly drawn to, I suppose, the kind of the glamour and the terror of the Mesozoic. So I was one of those boys who was obsessed by dinosaurs. And my obsession with dinosaurs moved by a kind of, a kind of inevitable course of progress to an obsession with ancient civilizations, and perhaps particularly with the Romans. And I can recognize that the Romans, in a sense, were to me what the Tyrannosaur had been: fierce, glamorous, extinct. And although I was interested in the Bible, and I particularly in the Old Testament stories, what I really liked were the terrifying empires that were always turning up and kicking sand in the face of the Israelites or the Judeans. So I was obsessed by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians, and then of course ultimately with the Romans. And the awful truth is that if you'd asked me to side with Jesus or Pontius Pilate, I would definitely have gone with Pontius Pilate, because he had, the purple cloak and the soldiers and the laurel wreaths and all that kind of thing. And so going into my teenage years and then beyond, I emotionally was engaged with classical Greece and Rome. And I guess that was the kind of sun that in a sense kind of dimmed my Christian faith. And then at a very susceptible age, as teenagers often do, I came across Nietzsche, and Nietzsche kind of seemed to confirm me in all my doubts about Christianity. And so essentially I just put it to one side as an interest, really, and focused on the Roman world in particular. When I was about early 30s, I began writing works of popular history. And the first book I wrote was about Julius Caesar, the age of Julius Caesar, the fall of the Roman Republic. The second one was about the Persian invasion of Greece. So that's Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, those kind of great battles. So I spent years and years kind of trying to get inside the heads of these ancient peoples in a way that I hadn't done previously. And I found the effect of that increasingly alienating, because it's one thing as a child to contemplate Caesar's conquest of Gaul, particularly if it's kind of suffused with a reading of Asterix, in which nobody ever dies. All that happens is that a centurion might end up in a tree with stars going around his head. But to get into the mindset of a people that celebrated an almost genocidal level of conquest. Caesar, it is said, with some authority, I think, I mean, the figures are clearly exaggerated, but not totally, slaughtered 1 million Gauls and enslaved another 1 million. And this was not a cause of anxiety to the Roman people. It was celebrated. Caesar bore these figures on placards carried through the streets of Rome. And likewise, as a child, I had thrilled to the narrative of Thermopylae, the courage of the Spartans standing in the pass. But to read about the way in which Spartan power was built on the systematic oppression of a conquered people who served the Spartans as helots, as effectively kind of serfs who are bred to be as doltish and servile as possible, I began to feel these are closer to Nazis than to anyone that I would want to compare myself to. And I increasingly began to feel, well, actually, these people are not me at all. I mean, they're terrifyingly, remotely alien. And so I began to, well, what's the process of change? Because, I'm surrounded by people, I myself, I have all these kind of values, these morals, these opinions, these assumptions. And actually, the classical world seems, the more I study it, the more remote and distant and frightening it comes to seem. So what's the change? And I increasingly came to realize that essentially it's Christianity, a sense that was sharpened for me then by writing a book about the origins of Islam. And the moment you engage with Islam, it's kind of, you were drawn into all kinds of debates and controversies. And I was writing this book against the backdrop of the rise of Islamic State and jihadi terrorism and everything. So I was having to read and think a lot about Islam. And that, although obviously Islam and Christianity have an enormous amount in common because they both emerge from a very similar matrix, it did sharpen for me again the sense in which a lot of what I found different about Islam, kind of alien about Islam, was sharpened for me by Christianity. And so essentially I wanted to write Dominion to put this thesis to the test, to see whether I could track the process of change. And there was one question in particular that really made me determined to write the book, which was when I was promoting the book on early Islam, In the Shadow of the Sword, I gave a talk, and there was a Muslim in the audience who put his hand up and said, "Why are you doing this? You would never do this to your own beliefs. Why are you questioning, essentially deconstructing the stories that we believe about our faith and the beginnings of our religion?" And I felt that was a very, very fair and reasonable question to put to me. And my values and beliefs, my myth was the Enlightenment myth. It was the belief that there was a period of darkness and then the Enlightenment came and everything was great. I've already begun to realize that was wrong. And so essentially I wanted to deconstruct the myths that I've been holding to since my teenage years. The idea that Christianity was something backward that had blotted out the sun of the classical world, and then Europe had been in a period of darkness until the coming of the Enlightenment. I began to realize that that was a total myth, and so Dominion is, in a sense, an exercise in I suppose it's a kind of exercise in apostasy. It's a repudiation of the myths in which I believed.
Interesting. And I mean, you're very aware, you pointed out in the book, how reluctant people are in the West now to contemplate that they can trace their values back to Christianity. You said, you shared that. So what, I know the book was published 18 months ago now, so you've had a fair bit of reviews and, a lot of reaction. What has been the pushback? I mean, have people basically been kind about it, or have you found a lot of anger, maybe, because it's pretty controversial, your thesis?
Not a huge amount of anger. I mean, I speak as someone who had death threats for writing the book on the origins of Islam. So it's all been, compared to that, it's all been rather tame. I was interested to see who would be, disagree with it, who would be angered with it. And it became evident to me within a very few, the opening reviews, that it was going to be humanists, secularists, I guess kind of evangelical atheists who were annoyed by it. And by and large, I found that Christians are quite enthusiastic about it, even though the book is
yeah, but I'm thinking about the folks for whom, as it was for you, it's the kind of Edward Gibbon rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Christianity was bad news for classical civilization, and basically it heralded what he calls this age of superstition and credulity. There's a lot of that sort of attitude towards Christianity around, isn't there?
Well, I've been blocked by the president of the humanists here in Britain. So I guess that's the humanist equivalent of, a fatwa.
Excommunication or something, yeah.
Yes. So I guess there are some who see me slightly as an apostate for having said this. But
well,
by and large, the conversation has been very, very civil. Yeah. And I think that there are quite a few people who don't want to believe that their values are culturally contingent, which essentially is what I'm arguing. But I think that even since I wrote the book and since it came out, that sense that the values that a liberal in a Western country may have, the assumption that they are somehow equivalent to universal global ideals, is really coming under strain, because last summer I thought really highlighted two events highlighted this. One of which was President Erdogan in Turkey reconsecrating what had been the Museum of Hagia Sophia to a mosque. So Hagia Sophia, of course, is the great cathedral built by Justinian, turned into a mosque in 1453 when Constantinople fell. And then when Ataturk set up the secular Turkish Republic, converted into a museum in the 30s. And Erdogan, by turning it back into a mosque, was essentially saying that the values enshrined by Ataturk, particularly of secularism, the idea that there is something called the secular, that this is not a kind of neutral universal concept, that it's a very, very specifically European ideal, and I would say more specifically a Christian ideal, and that he was rejecting that. And in parallel to that, you had Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India laying down the foundation stone of a great temple to the hero of the Ramayana, Rama, who was meant to have been born there. And in the late 20th century, Hindu radicals became convinced that a mosque that stood in Ayodhya had been built under the Mughals to blot out the evidence of there having been a temple there commemorating Rama's birth. And it got torn down by a Hindu mob in the early 90s. And this was an absolute affront to India's secular constitution. Modi, by laying the foundation stone, was effectively, rather as Erdogan was, turning his back on the idea of the secular as something neutral, as a kind of, and secularists as kind of referees holding the ring between different things called religions. Because again, essentially what is being rejected there is the idea that categories like the secular and like religion are somehow neutral. They're not. They're very, very specifically and transparently bred of the great seedbed of Christian theology and history. And whether Modi recognizes that, or whether it's just something he's inchoately responding to, I don't know. But I think it's telling that both those leaders, both of them born into republics that define themselves as secular, both in the course of last summer so decisively repudiated them. And I think that as Western power retreats, so its cultural hegemony is going to retreat as well. And increasingly, things that people in the West assume are universal will be shown up as being no such thing, that these are culturally contingent, and I would argue in their essentials, deeply Christian.
So, hopefully we'll come back to some of these big questions towards the end, but I want to drill down into some of the kind of characters and things that are points of your argument. But the first one, before we look at specific kind of thinkers in history, there's no question that the book is framed by the crucifixion. It kind of starts there and sort of ends there as well. Why is this event so specifically central to your understanding of the argument?
Well, I was a couple of chapters into writing it when I made a film about Islamic State in northern Iraq. And I went there in 2016 when the Islamic State was still very much a presence in northern Iraq. I went to a town called Sinjar, which was the main center for the Yazidis, the religious minority, who I'm sure most people listening will remember were brutally targeted by the Islamic State. Lots of their women were enslaved, men were slaughtered, some of them were crucified. And I went to Sinjar. I think I was the second Western camera crew to go there after it had been retaken by the Kurds. And to stand in the rubble of this town where women had been harvested as slaves and men had been crucified was to feel myself transplanted back pretty much into a kind of world that the Romans would have recognized. The horrors that the Islamic State visited on Sinjar were what a Roman legion might have visited on a city that refused to surrender. And to stand there and know that the people who had crucified were a couple of miles away across open landscape really, really brought home to me just how much freight was carried with the idea of crucifixion being something that was liberating. Because, of course, the Islamic State had no notion of that. The Islamic State were using crucifixion as the Romans had used it, as a punishment to humiliate and terrify. And for the Romans, crucifixion was seen as the worst of fates because it was painful, agonizing, protracted, and public. So people could see your humiliation. And that's essentially what the Islamic State were up to as well. So when I came back, I thought, the gap between how the Romans understood crucifixion and how we today understand it. So even if you're not a Christian, you're lying on a road, a van pulls up and it's got a cross on the side, that's a good thing. And I think that by and large, we've become desensitized to this. We don't think, the cross is such a kind of universal symbol of Christianity that it's very easy not to think about what it represents. But I came back and thought, this is, the weirdness of Christianity, and Christianity is very, very weird, is absolutely summed up by the cross. And in the way, there are two people in the book who most profoundly recognize this. And the book is structured kind of very carefully. So the first person is 3 chapters in, and that, of course, is Paul, who spends his whole time going, wow, this is just beyond weird. He got nailed to a cross. How odd is that? This is a stumbling block to the Jews, and it's likely to seem completely mad to everyone else, to all the Greeks and the Romans and everyone. It's insane, and yet that's what I believe, and everything follows from this. And then the other person, who is 3 chapters from the end, is Friedrich Nietzsche, who likewise is scandalized by the cross. He's shocked by it, and seems to penetrate to what is shocking about it And therefore, I guess what is theologically significant about it, far more profoundly than many a Christian that I've read.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll come back to Nietzsche, and you know, obviously a really, really important figure for your book. But I wonder if I can begin with another significant figure, and that's Julian the Apostate. This, as he's known, Emperor Julian from the 4th century, a nephew of the first Christian emperor, Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, and yet he wants to push back against what's been happening with the Christianization of the empire and so on. Now, you quote from a letter, or you kind of cite a letter that he wrote to the high priest, I think, of one of the kind of Roman cults about all of this. And you clearly felt that this is really significant. What's going on in that letter, and what's interesting about it?
Okay, so Julian basically wants to turn the clock back. He wants the temples of the old gods to be full of happy worshippers, and he writes to the high priest of a temple in the middle of what's now Turkey, and it's the mother goddess Kibele, which in a way is one of, a goddess whose worship stretches back centuries and centuries and centuries. People have been worshipping her for ages and ages and ages, and yet it seems that her cult is in palpable decline. And Julian writes to her and says, look, pull your fingers out. Your priests should be out there doing as the Christians do, kind of bringing charity, feeding the hungry, and sheltering those who have no shelter, because that's what the gods have always wanted. That's not what the gods always wanted. Specifically what Kibele wants is her priests to hack off their testicles and roam the roads, kind of singing and dancing and exposing themselves. Charity and charitable giving doesn't come into the equation at all. And so you may wonder, what on earth is Julian on about? And the truth is that Julian basically wants a model of paganism that is derivative of Christianity. Already, within only a few decades of Constantine's conversion, it's become impossible for a self-avowed opponent of Christianity, a self-avowed devotee of the old gods and the traditional ways, not to see the world through Christian eyes. And there's a case for saying that in many ways, Julian is in terms of his concern for the poor, in terms of his spirituality, is the most Christian of all the Roman emperors, perhaps precisely because he turns against it. But he's so shaped by Christian assumptions and attitudes that he just can't escape them.
Fascinating. So his whole understanding of what constitutes a religion, what constitutes a kind of an obligation to the gods, has been Christianized. You
see, immediately when you use the word religion, this was one of the issues why I wanted to write the book, was because writing about the pre-Christian world, I increasingly found that the very use of English made it almost impossible to articulate what I wanted to articulate, because so many words were kind of saturated with Christian assumptions, of which the word religion would be one. I don't think that we can use the word religion without anachronism until you're writing about the 18th century, really, maybe 17th century, in the sense that we use it today. And so to describe, Roman religion or ancient Egyptian religion or whatever is profoundly anachronistic. And in a sense, that's what was going on with Erdogan and Modi, is that I think it's problematic as well to describe things like Hinduism and Islam as religions, because to do that is inherently to Christianize them, because our category of religion is something that is bred of the evolution of Christian thought and practice. And it's the measure of Christianity's hegemonic stature that essentially it's kind of recalibrated the way that we understand other cultural and civilizational traditions in its own image, and the past as well.
Yeah, so Julian basically looks at what the Christian churches are doing and their networks of care and concern. He wants the temples to be doing exactly the same thing. And you say that he discovers that a concern for the downtrodden couldn't merely be summoned out of nothing. So even that fundamental kind of commitment to looking after those who are less fortunate than oneself is absent.
I mean, there are traditions. So, you know, in the Odyssey, the beggar is given shelter. There are traditions that you should look after strangers because they might be a god, but there isn't a sense that the poor have a value in and of themselves. Indeed, precisely the opposite. They are despised and looked down on, and slaves in particular. And what you have in the 4th century, so the same time as Julian, that his contemporaries may even have known him, there are kind of letters that are probably faked, is that in Cappadocia, in the center of what's now Turkey, you get a succession, you have a remarkable family. Basil, who becomes a bishop, and builds this great complex, which is essentially the first great kind of hospital. And it's open to lepers and to the poor and to the hungry and to the starving. But his brother, Gregory, who becomes Bishop of Nysa, a town just down the road, he goes even further. And he argues that slavery itself as an institution should be abolished. And he argues that because he says, well, Christ suffered death as a slave. And so therefore, in a sense, slaves are closer to God than the masters. And if Christ was a slave, then we must redeem all slaves. Just as Christ said, you know, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. The Cappadocians are pushing the implications of this in ways that foreshadow how in future centuries other Christians also will come to understand these teachings. And the thing about Christianity, I think, is that I think it's best thought of as a kind of depth charge, placed deep beneath the fabric of Roman civilization. And to begin with, you barely hear it. But the ripple effects of it becomes more and more seismic. It convulses and transforms the Roman Empire. And then after the Roman Empire has fallen, those ripple effects continue to spill out and spill out and spill out. And they continue to spill out today. It seems to me that the huge cultural movements, the culture wars, the transformative processes racking societies across the West, that all of these would be unthinkable without that initial depth charge, that they are the ripple effects that are still spilling out.
Mm. You got some great stuff about this whole family. So Basil and his brother Gregory, and Macrina, the sister, as well. Yeah. So Gregory has got this concern about slavery. Macrina's got the concern about exposed children and basically abandoned.
Who are the lowest of the low, because it's taken for granted that you should, you know, if you have a child you don't need, you just expose it, and it will either die or be taken away by animals, or it will be picked up by slavers. And if they're girls, they'll be essentially brought up to work in brothels. You know, if they're boys, who knows what may happen to them. And this is completely taken for granted. So Macrina, the sister of Basil and Gregory, and who is kind of regarded by them in a way as their kind of spiritual superior, absolutely devotes her life to going around rescuing them. And it's, again, it's founded on the idea that those who are weak have value, that, you know, as Christ humbled himself for the good of those who are slaves to sin, so the Christian in his honor should do the same and care for those who are absolutely at the bottom of the pile. And the kind of, you know, there's an archaeological measure for this, which is that, you know, if you excavate the sewage system of a Greco-Roman city, it will be full of the kind of the tracery work of tiny little bones, so babies that have been sluiced down into a sewer. In the sewers of Christian towns, you no longer find that tracery of tiny bones. So it's evident in the archaeology.
I suppose a kind of a reading of your book would be, okay, you know, yeah, this guy's saying all virtue is with the Christians, and you know, nothing with anybody else. But actually, it's more complex than that. Even at the time of Gregory, I mean, many Christians had no problems with owning slaves.
No, well, I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which to answer that. The first, of course, is that our idea about what is good, I think, is a Christian one. I mean, that's Nietzsche's great point. That we judge the world and we judge Christianity by Christian standards, even those who are opposed to it by and large, unless you have the kind of bracing honesty of a Nietzsche who wants to re-enshrine the classical values of kind of strength and power. What was it? Remind me what the...
Yeah, I mean, actually, that idea, though, that...
Oh, yes, the slaves. Yes, sorry. Yes, the slaves. Okay, so
like Gregory, basically, they weren't, were they?
Yeah, yeah. So the slaves, the slavery thing is a really fascinating example of what I was talking about, this depth charge effect, that it's a very, very slow burn. Because even Basil, when Gregory says we should get rid of slavery, says that's ridiculous, because if we do, what will happen to the slaves? They won't have anyone to look after them. So he kind of casts slavery as a kind of, kind of welfare, work for welfare kind of program. Now, it is true that over the course of the Middle Ages in Latin Europe, slavery does start to fade. But of course, then it gets reintroduced in the most monstrous way when Europeans discover the New World. And the first people who suffer from that are the Indians in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. And immediately you get friars who argue against the exploitation that they discover in the Spanish New World by directly citing scripture and essentially kind of echoing the arguments that Gregory of Nyssa had made. Bartolomé Las Casas is a Dominican friar, is the kind of representative figure for that, and he gets into a great argument in Spain, arguing that although the Indians are not Christian, nevertheless they have souls, and therefore, because they are oppressed, therefore they are beloved of Christ. And it's fascinating that in the debate with that, the argument that is opposed to that derives not from the Bible, but from Greek philosophy, and specifically from Aristotle and his argument that certain people are fitted to be slaves. So Las Casas, by contrast, is drawing on a tradition that reaches back to the 12th century, which is a kind of assumption that if the rich, as Christ says, are obligated to give to the poor, then it stands to reason that the poor have rights to certain goods. They have rights not to be enslaved, not to be tormented, not to be go hungry, not to go shelterless. And so you get, over the course of the medieval Christendom, this doctrine of human rights, which is something very radical, very novel, very transformative. And it's this doctrine of human rights that Las Casas, as a Catholic, invokes against the enslavement and oppression of Indians in the New World. Simultaneously, increasingly from the late 16th through the 17th into the 18th century, you are also seeing a Protestant version of this with the expansion of the Anglo-American world. And the English settlers, likewise, they need slaves to run their plantations. And so they, rather as the Spanish have done, start to look to Africa. And although there are, in the 17th century, so Cromwell, for instance, deports large numbers of people from Ireland when he conquers Ireland. People from England as well who were defeated in the Civil War are transported to the Caribbean to work as slaves. Nevertheless, increasingly, slavery in the 17th and then into the 18th century becomes racialized. And this, I think, problematizes slavery as an institution for Christians who are honest with themselves. Because although it is true that nowhere in the Bible does it say that slavery is evil as an institution, and indeed, you can interpret particularly the Pentateuch, but also some of Paul's letters, to justify the existence of slavery as an institution. What is pretty fundamental to Christian teaching is the idea that all human beings are created equally in the image of God, that therefore they all partake in the dignity of God, And as Paul says, if there is no Greek or Jew, no slave or free, then there is certainly no black or white. And that preys on the conscience of increasing numbers of Protestants in the Anglo-American world. And it particularly affects Protestants who subscribe to a very, very specific understanding of Scripture and its relationship to the Spirit, that the Spirit descends on you. You're in, you know, you are born again, you are granted grace, you are enlightened. And the enlightenment enables you to read Scripture and to penetrate to the truths that are buried there below the printed word, to feel the truth of God's word illumine and irradiate your souls. And it's particularly associated with Quakers, then with Baptists, then with evangelicals. And you get this sense of kind of almost literally a Pentecostal fire, kind of blazing and blazing. And it's fueled by this understanding of Scripture that, properly understood, Scripture does not tolerate slavery. And it fuses with this idea that there is something problematic about racialized slavery to generate what becomes the kind of abolitionist movement, the first mass movement to abolish slavery that has ever existed. And amazingly, in the wake of the defeat of Napoleon, when the great powers in Europe meet at Vienna to kind of draw up a new order, the British Foreign Secretary has basically, although he's not interested in the subject really, there have been so many mass protests in England that he feels he has no choice but to go to the kind of cynical, grim diplomats that he's meeting up with in Vienna and say, look, we've got to work to abolish the slave trade. Most of these other leaders, of course, are Catholic. So the Protestant British and the Catholic leaders that Castlereagh is negotiating with construct what becomes a kind of model for international law, which is designed to be applicable both to Catholics and to Protestants. And it fuses the kind of the Protestant abolitionism with the Catholic tradition of human rights to construct this model of human law, of international law, that the European powers, and the British in particular, then export around the world. So, for instance, it gets exported to the Muslim world, and the Muslims basically are forced to Protestantize themselves, because they end up having to say, okay, well, in the Quran, it may say that slavery is legitimate, but the truth is that actually God doesn't want slavery. I mean, that's a Protestant reading, essentially. And that understanding of international law, rooted in the melding of the Protestant and Catholic traditions, gets exported by the colonial powers and outlives the European empires. So it gets embedded within the fabric of the United Nations, within the framework, the corpus of international law. And again, to kind of reiterate what I said earlier about the retreat of Western power, as Western economic, financial, military power retreats, so I think its ability to identify this tradition with something called international law will become ever more problematic.
Fascinating. You've got a chapter on the folks who are kind of more identified with the whole language of human rights than anybody, which are the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, Voltaire and so on. And I'm sure that this does particularly infuriate a lot of humanists and rationalists, because you kind of argue that Voltaire, who kind of views Christianity with a you say a hatred that borders on fixation, that actually his arguments are steeped in Christian assumptions and steeped in a Christian notion of the person even.
Well, for starters, they're universalist, and universalism again is not something that comes naturally to everyone. It's really a kind of, I guess, a Muslim and a Christian tradition. The idea that everyone across the world should be brought to your way of thinking. Voltaire does this in a kind of rather passive-aggressive way by saying that philosophers in Beijing or in Latin America or whatever are like him, but essentially he is kind of colonizing the rest of the world with his moral assumptions, drawing an equation between them. He is also very committed to the idea that well, he said, écraser l'infâme, let's destroy this monstrous thing, by which essentially he means the Catholic Church, but by extension the whole of Christianity. Let's overthrow the idols of superstition. Let's cleanse ourselves of all this kind of nonsensical mumbo jumbo. Let's bring the people who walk in darkness into light. So hence the idea of enlightenment. But of course, where are these ideas? Where are these tropes? Where are these images? Where are these obligations deriving from? They're clearly deriving from the Reformation. I mean, all this language it's the Reformation through and through. The Protestant reformers are, just as Voltaire cast Christianity, the Protestant reformers have cast the medieval church. But again, where are the Protestant reformers getting it from? Well, ultimately, it goes back even before Christianity to the Hebrew prophets, who look at the idols of Babylon or Egypt and say, these are just stock and stone, let's throw them out. The Hebrew prophets are massively into the business of kind of desacralizing springs and stones and mountaintops and rivers. They are interested in bringing, the people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. I mean, that's this is Isaiah. So Voltaire's assumption that superstition should be something to be banished, that something called superstition exists and it should be banished. Again, it has a cultural pedigree, and that pedigree is Christian. And then each of the chapters in Dominion begins with a kind of a particular scene. And in the chapter on the Enlightenment, I begin with Voltaire's campaign to rectify a travesty of justice when a Huguenot, a French Protestant, was accused of having been responsible for the death of his son. And he gets broken to death very horribly and publicly on a wheel. And Voltaire is appalled by this and launches a campaign to win this man a posthumous pardon. And he writes letters. It's kind of like the first great example of a kind of modern campaign, like kind of Amnesty International or something. He writes all these letters, and he gets this guy his pardon in the long run. And it's interesting, I think, on two levels. One is, why is Voltaire so upset about this? Why is he presuming that this is something worth shouting from the rafters? And why is he upset that an innocent man has suffered a monstrous death, crushed to death by an oppressive apparatus? Because that's what Christianity has at its heart. This man is Christ. And in turn, the evidence for that is not just in Voltaire's indignation at it, but the fact that his campaign wins, that people accept the justice of it, that Christians across France say, yes, this is monstrous and terrible. So I think in all kinds of ways, what the Enlightenment philosophes are kind of interesting as an example of what will become a modern phenomenon of people who are not just rejecting aspects of Christian history as the Protestant reformers had done, but believe that they are rejecting much of the whole fabric of Christianity and religion as an entirety, and yet in fact are doing so for very Christian motives and in very Christian ways, and have as their ideal ones that are clearly rooted in Christian assumptions. And so where Voltaire leads the French revolutionaries and the Russian revolutionaries, and I would argue progressives today in universities who condemn Christianity for, as white supremacy or as cultural imperialism or whatever, they're doing exactly the same as well.
Well, this kind of universalization of these ideas is we see it in the French Revolution, we see it very much in the American Revolution, all of them deeply influenced by by Enlightenment thinkers, and Declaration of Independence, isn't it? We've got that that phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that
right.
all men
so why do they hold them to be self-evident?
But I mean, to actually question that they are self-evident is to undermine, in a way, isn't it, the whole of the Western project of the last 300 years, possibly?
Yeah. possibly.
Yes.
I mean, I think that yes, essentially the past 300 years, intellectual history and indeed in a sense political history in the West for the past 300 years has been a process of groping around, trying to find justifications for essentially Christian assumptions that do not lie in Christianity. And I don't think any of them are really very convincing. And I think that's as evident today in 2021 as it was when the founding fathers were proclaiming self-evident truths.
In the United States, obviously, the question of whether the founding fathers were Christian or rationalist or whatever is a big issue. But I mean, you're saying
they're both.
It's very, very clear that they are Christian Enlightenment thinkers.
Well, the United States is, it's shaped by two different Protestant traditions. So there's the Quaker tradition that is associated with Pennsylvania, which has that idea that that you look into the heart, it's the Quakers who lie behind the abolitionist movement. It's that particular kind of radical Protestant understanding of the relationship with Scripture. And then there's the tradition associated with the Pilgrim Fathers and Massachusetts, it kind of these are streams that essentially are flowing from the England of the 17th century, which is a kind of great crucible of Protestant radicalism, and because these are flowing into the United States. These kind of different traditions merge and blend to create what is, I think, a very kind of distinctive religious culture spanning British Isles and North America. And to give it a topical spin, one of the ways in which this manifests itself, I think, is in the attempt to construct a kind of a rationalist justification for assumptions that ultimately are rooted in faith, of which the Jefferson and so on are kind of probably the paradigms. But it also generates a convulsive yearning for a kind of purity, for the whole of society, really, to obtain grace, a consciousness of sin that has to be washed away. And this is a kind of impulse that generates a sense that people need to be awakened. They need to see the truth. And so you get what is called the Great Awakening in the 18th century. And it, over the course of subsequent centuries, again and again, you get this sense increasingly in America rather than in Britain, well, that happens in Britain as well, this idea that people have to be wakened to the truth. And so that's why today people talk about the Great Awakening. I mean, it's a good pun, but it's more than a pun, because the very concept of being woke, of being awakened, markets it as being rooted in this very distinctive Protestant tradition. And I think essentially, the Great Awakening is a great awakening that doesn't recognize its own Christian character.
Yeah. Okay, so you've mentioned Nietzsche a few times already, and I mean he's somebody who looms large in your book, and you've got a particular section devoted to him, but he's there in many other places, because in some ways Nietzsche is your kind of your key witness, isn't he? Because he actually makes your case for you in lots of ways. His argument is very much that the morality of the West is, from start to finish, this Christian morality that he wants to destroy.
Slave morality, as he notoriously calls it. Yeah, and I said how, when I was a teenager, Nietzsche kind of essentially kind of confirmed my loss of faith. And coming back to him, I found him, I think, in a way, the most convincing witness to Christian faith of almost anyone that I read. And I read a lot of Christian theologians, but in a sense, I said how Nietzsche penetrates to the heart of what is shocking about the cross, and he's revolted by it. And he recognizes in a very clear-sighted way, because he understands what the classical world was, and he sees how Christianity changed that, so that we can barely look at the classical world and understand it properly. He argues that, God may be dead, as he, in the famous parable, but he still lies in the cave, and his shadow casts, flickering shadows. And essentially that's the world as Nietzsche sees it, that the Western world is now in, that people think that they can have Christian belief, Christian values without Christian belief. And he says that socialists and communists and liberals and are all basically Christians. Philosophers are secret priests, that they're all saturated in Christian assumptions, and therefore the need is to throw that off and to embrace the chaos and the convulsion that will follow from truly killing God, truly finishing God off. And of course, Nietzsche is writing this before most of what happens in the 20th century. And when we read Nietzsche, know what is going to happen.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when you read Nietzsche, you recognize the degree to which the real anti-Christian radicals are the fascists. Because the fascists, unlike the communists, are not just rejecting institutional religion, they're rejecting the foundational values as well. The communists are wedded to the idea that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. I mean, that's the kind of the great animating principle. The idea that there is, the downtrodden and the poor have a value that is greater than the oppressor and the rich is absolutely what the Russian Revolution is all about. But for fascists, and particularly the Nazis, they are contemptuous of the idea that there's any dignity in weakness. They decisively repudiate that. The weak should be disposed of. That's the moral thing to do. As the Spartans had thrown, weak babies down a ravine, so a responsible fascist should treat those who are disabled or unable to serve the cause of the Reich. And of course, even more profoundly, the Nazis reject that foundational idea of Christianity going back to Genesis, ultimately, that all human beings are created in the image of God, that there is no Jew or Greek. The Nazis completely think that Jews and Greeks are separate. And it's not just, there is a moral responsibility to destroy the Jews so that someone equivalent to Paul will not emerge and do to the Third Reich what Paul did to the Roman Empire, as the Nazis see it. And so you get the kind of perhaps the most grotesque paradox in the entire history of Christianity, which is threaded through with paradox, that the Nazis target Jews for genocide because they blame the Jews for Christianity, even as they're drawing on the anti-Semitic tropes, bred of Christian anti-Semitism, to provide colouring for their supposedly scientific racism.
So here's Nietzsche celebrating, because he was a classicist, wasn't he? Knew the ancient world back to front. He celebrates Dionysus, the kind of, and that whole notion of the self-constructed individual, the kind of dynamic person who doesn't have any obligations to anybody really, but himself, and creates his own values, his own life, and that's celebrated. And then you got that kind of contrasted with Jesus, so that his very last book is Dionysus against the crucified, Ecce Homo. Do you find it interesting or bizarre in any way that a lot of kind of contemporary ideology, if you like, is about self-construction? I mean, does that owe its origin to Nietzsche rather than to anything else in the modern world? And therefore, are we really, what we're really about is the celebration of naked power?
I think that I think it's more a legacy of Protestantism, to be honest. The idea that each individual has a kind of personal relationship with God. So in the Middle Ages, there's a sense in which religio it's the responsibility of those, monks and friars and nuns and so on, that in a sense they are doing the hard work of establishing a relationship with God for everybody else. With the Reformation, that's no longer the case. Every individual has to forge a kind of personal relationship with God and to kind of wrestle and to think about it. And inevitably that places a kind of greater premium on the individual and kind of fosters an individualism. I think that that's for good and bad in the long run, and there's a sense in which I think in the present, because increasingly the intellectual commanding heights in the West are no longer theologically literate. It's no longer understood through the prism of the theology and the scriptural inheritance that fashioned it. There's a kind of groping around for new ways to understand it. I think on the absolute fringes of the alt-right there maybe is a kind of Nietzschean quality to this, but I think that by and large that is so toxic because of the people's horror at what the Nazis did, that it's not really a kind of mainstream movement. I think that it's kind of expressing itself in just a kind of incredible variety of ways, and people are groping around for ways to combat it, because I think that the sense that it leads to a kind of selfishness is very widely felt, and some of the responses to that remain Christian, overtly Christian, but you also get it in turn. I think environmentalism is another way that it channels it. So I think that we do live in a kind of a fragmentation, but the essential inheritance remains a Christian one. It remains, in the English-speaking world, it remains a Protestant one.
So I suppose at the end of your massive book, the question is, what does any of this matter? Why does it, what does it matter where our values come from? I mean, I know some of my friends will say to me something along the lines of, well, so what that my values originally came from Christianity? It doesn't matter where they came from. These are my values now.
Yeah.
What does it matter to do this kind of archaeology? What difference does it make to actually the way we kind of live in the world?
Well, I kind of agree with that. I mean, it does seem odd to me that so many people who define themselves as humanist and convinced of the truth of, say, evolution are so appalled by the idea that they themselves might be the product of cultural evolution. So it's like Bishop Wilberforce refusing to accept that he's descended from an ape, indeed that he is an ape. And I find it odd, actually. Although I don't really, I mean, I understand why they do, but objectively, if you think that God doesn't exist, what's the issue with saying, well, yes, okay, so my values come from Christianity? I don't see what the problem is. I think, why does it matter? I think it matters essentially because if you want to keep blooms fresh, you need to water them. So it seems to me that the beliefs and values of Christianity are rooted in theology and a supernatural understanding of the cosmos. That the idea that human rights exist, that humans have an inherent dignity, that they have an inherent equality, is a theological notion ultimately, and that if you don't recognize that, then how do you sustain it? And I think also, as I've been saying throughout this conversation, that we live in an age where the conceit that people in the West have been able to enjoy for the past 200 years, thanks to their global supremacy, is coming under threat. The conceit, namely, is that our values are equivalent to human values, that somehow they're universal. They're not universal. They're culturally contingent. And if we want to defend them, then we need to recognize that, because otherwise, you know, we're not going to be able to cope with a world in which other parts of the world essentially are kind of getting back in touch with the inheritance of their traditions.
Well, here's what you wrote at the fairly close to the end of the book. To be a Christian is to believe that God became man and suffered a death as terrible as any mortal has ever suffered. This is why the cross, that ancient implement of torture, remains what it has always been, the fitting symbol of the Christian revolution. It is the audacity of it, the audacity of finding in a twisted and defeated corpse the glory of the creator of the universe, that serves to explain more surely than anything else the sheer strangeness of Christianity and of the civilization that to which it gave birth. It's kind of a revolutionary notion that you kind of appeal to. Do you think it still goes on, this revolution?
Completely. I mean, we live in one of the great ages of Christianity. It may not seem like that in the West, although I think that humanism, liberalism, secularism, whatever you want to call it, is unthinkable without Christianity, and in that sense is an ongoing manifestation of trends within Christian history that reach back centuries, indeed millennia. But you can see, particularly in Africa, this has been one of the great explosions of Christian faith, analogous to the way that it rippled and expanded through early medieval Europe. And although I cut it from the book because I didn't really have, I already had so much to write about, but I would have written about Pentecostalism perhaps in particular, which is literally a kind of fire, the idea of faith as fire spreading around the world. And this really, along with radical Islam, is one of the two great kind of manifestations of spirituality in the 21st century world. And Islamic radicalism is, everyone knows about it because it kind of hits the headlines. It's in your face. Pentecostalism is kind of below the water. Well, below the water is probably the wrong metaphor to use. But I mean, it's kind of below the ground. It's burning away. But this is one of the great movements. And that sense of kind of gospel fire spreading is out there in the world today. And actually, it's kind of coming back to the great cities of the West. So I live in London. There are all kinds of Pentecostal churches just on the main street from where I'm sitting here. And London, which was traditionally the kind of the Babylon, the sump of sin, is now, I think, has the highest concentration of Christian believers of anywhere in Britain. And I imagine the same would be said of New York or Toronto or whatever. That in the great cities of the West, the diaspora from, I think, particularly Africa, is kind of re-evangelizing these kind of Babylons.
Well, Tom, thanks for joining us to talk about your book, Dominion. Thanks for writing it. It's an extraordinary book, and I hope you get lots more readers for it. Thank you, folks, for joining us for this conversation, and we'll do it again soon. All the best.
Thanks very much.